On this episode of Still Loading, we throw a rager in the wait, hold on, I have an
rage.
I was going rager in the sheets and fun in the streets.
There it is.
There it is.
There we go.
Having fun in this. Do you want to have you want to have sheets or streets first? That's the real. Like, what's the punchline?
Yeah.
Sheets should be second.
Rager in the streets, fun in the sheets.
Yeah.
There we go. Well, that's so dumb. I love it. Let's do it.
Fun in the streets. You're raging in the sheets.
That's
why fun in the streets, raging in the streets. No, fun in the streets, raging in the sheets.
There it is.
There we go. All right. On this episode of Still Loading, fun in the sheets, raging. No, God damn it.
It's like hard to get. It's hard to figure it out. Yeah, it is.
Okay. On this episode of Still Loading, fun in the streets, raging in the sheets. Finally, there we go.
God, there it is.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of the Still Loading podcast. I'm your host, Josh Koval, and today on the show, we are diving into some Sega history, some Sega gaming. I don't talk enough about Sega on the show. I've done, actually, it's kind of funny that I say that because at the time this comes out, literally the previous episode was an episode on the Sega SG-1000. But normally I don't talk enough about Sega, and I figured why not? Apparently here's another semi-impromptu series that I didn't even mean to do. We had Sega SG-1000 last week, and this week we are talking about the iconic Sega series, or at least the first game specifically, Streets of Rage for the Sega Mega Drive / the Sega Genesis, if you're cool here in North America. But with me today to discuss the Streets of Rage and to rage in the sheets with me, as it were. Let's start off with my friend from Retro Hangover, Chris Copeland. Chris, how are you doing?
I'm doing great down here in Florida, Josh. Having a great time down here.
That's great. That's great to hear. Who knows if that joke will make it stay in or not? Otherwise, I almost want to cut it out just so listeners have no context for why that was funny. So yes, Chris, thank you so much for joining me. And my other guest on this episode is Coury from the YouTube channel My Life in Gaming. Coury, how are you doing today?
I'm doing okay down here in Kentucky. You know, up here in Pennsylvania, we call the middle section Pennsyltucky. Oh, yeah.
Because it's you got those liberal hippies over in Philadelphia and those liberal hippies over in Pittsburgh, and everything in between. It's Pennsyltucky.
I grew up kind of close. I grew up just north of Erie, Pennsylvania.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. So, but were you in New York or actually in Pennsylvania?
I lived in New York State.
Okay.
In Jamestown, New York is where I grew up, right on Chautauqua Lake.
Chautauqua. That's so far. So I'm on the eastern side of the state. I'm over on Philly area. So
got it.
In the Philly area. So that is like a 10-hour minimum drive.
It's one of those drives that looks really small on the map, and then it takes an entire day.
Pennsylvania is deceptive because you would think, it takes 10 hours. So from near where I live, like I said, Philly-ish or in Philly it's 10 hours just to get down to North Carolina. And that's you're going through Virginia and Maryland and little bits of Delaware here and there, even depending on which route you take.
Mm-hmm.
And to get down to where I have family in North Carolina, it takes 10 hours. So you're driving through 2 or 3 states. So I think we go into West Virginia sometimes, depending on the whichever route's fastest. But it takes about 8 hours just to drive across Pennsylvania, and let alone that's a straight shot. If you go north or south from where I'm at, that's going to be even more because you're going even farther. It's such a weirdly shaped state that you would never expect it to be as big as it is.
Yeah, as long, I guess.
Mm-hmm. But okay, enough about state geography. We are here to talk about Streets of Rage. We're going to rage in the streets and the sheets and all that other good stuff.
Yes.
To kick off this episode, though, of course, we have to talk about our personal histories with this game and with the series, of course, if you'd like to delve into that. I'm actually going to go first only because mine is very quick and it would be very anticlimactic to end with me. Mine is that I never grew up with this game. I had friends who enjoyed this game, and I've played it a handful of times, and that's about. I've never beaten it, mind you. I played a chunk of it for this episode. It gets very difficult towards the end. I even tried playing it with save states on my PC, but without playing. I'm going to save that for when we get into the gameplay. But needless to say, the emulated version I tried did not go well, so I went back to the console version without save states. And that's about my extent of history with this game. It's basically none, but that's why I have you two esteemed guests on the show, because both of you have extensive history with this game. So Chris, we'll start off with you. What's your personal history with Streets of Rage 1 and the series in general?
So getting to the series in general, Streets of Rage 2, I know we're talking about Streets of Rage, bear with me. Streets of Rage 2 was the first Sega Genesis game I had owned. It's not the first I played. I think the first games I played on the Genesis, because my neighbors had it, was, of course, Sonic the Hedgehog, because everyone played that back then. And I think they had Outrun, because I don't remember specifically what it was. I wasn't into like Ferraris and cars at the time. I'm still kind of not, but I do really like Outrun. So I look back and I think it was Sonic and Outrun, but the console came with Streets of Rage 2. It was part of, I guess, like the fighter bundle, even though it's technically not a fighting game. Beat 'em up hadn't generally had a term yet, from what I remember. I mean, what the hell do I know? I was like 7. So
we weren't calling them belt scrollers here.
Right. Were you calling them beat 'em ups back then? I can't. I mean, I have no idea.
I mean, I don't know, brawlers maybe.
Probably.
But fighters.
They called it the fighter console, and it came with a cool controller called the Mega Fire. And I fell in love with Streets of Rage 2, playing it with my friends. And of course, when you get addicted to one game and you're like, oh, there's a 2 at the end, I want to figure out what was before that, which generally is a good idea unless the name of your game is Street Fighter. I digress. But I went back and I played some Streets of Rage, and I noticed that it was, a little bit more difficult, a little bit more inaccessible, didn't have as many move lists, but it was still fun. It had a lot of things that were still really good about it, that the characters controlled really well. So, of course, I really liked that game too. And all this time, I had never played Final Fight. I didn't even know what Final Fight was, if I'm being completely honest. I still to this day, I don't think I've ever actually seen it in an arcade physically.
Really?
And really. Hey. And if I have, I don't remember it. I don't think I really remember going and seeing any arcade until the second wave of Street Fighter games came out. So like Championship Edition, because you have to remember, like Final Fight came out in '89. I was 4. I wouldn't have seen it.
Yeah, that would make sense then.
Yeah. So like, and those are my first beat 'em up. My first beat 'em up was Double Dragon, which it's funny because the first NES game I ever played, first Nintendo game I played, was Double Dragon 2, which came alongside Super Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt. And then I get to the Genesis.
I love Double Dragon 2 on the NES.
It is a good game. It is a good game. Yeah. Way better than Double Dragon 1. But the first game for the Genesis, Streets of Rage 2, both games way better than their predecessors. But I think Streets of Rage held up. And now that I've played some Final Fight and I've seen it, I've experienced it, I see what Sega was trying to do. But overall, like the Streets of Rage series, specifically 1, 2, and 4, they have a big place in my heart. I love them to death, and I consider them to be the quintessential beat 'em up collection out of any series. Period.
Excellent.
And I believe Streets of Rage, just as a little quick history lesson, because I always try to find what research I was able to do, I try to find good ways to sneak in the little fun facts. It was inspired by the Final Fight series, correct?
Oh,
yeah.
I mean, it exists because Final Fight, because Final Fight was coming to the Super NES, which was, came out at the same time. I mean, the Streets of Rage, came out like a week before, in the US at least, before the Super Nintendo launched with Final Fight.
And didn't Final Fight, I believe Final Fight Arcade came out at the same time that the Genesis came out. I believe like the original Final Fight in the arcade
89.
came out when the Genesis did. So Sega was like, oh shit, we need to get on this. And they knew Final Fight was going to go to Super Nintendo exclusively. So they're like, well, we need our own Final Fight.
Yes.
And that's kind of where and then the director, Noriyoshi Oba, saw that and kind of used I wrote down a bunch of the influences. There was a whole bunch, like Double Dragon, Final Fight, as well as it was inspired by detective shows, apparently, like Starsky and Hutch, and then it was also inspired by the A-Team.
Maybe for its themes and design, but
yeah. In terms of thematic stuff, not in terms of like gameplay, obviously.
Well, some of the sprites are directly lifted from Final Fight. It's like there's no shame.
Yeah, they knew that they needed to have something like that to compete because everybody was talking about it, and they knew that the thing that they needed to deliver with that is 2-player simultaneous, because the Super Nintendo version did not have that. That was like their priority. I guess I just go into like my whole experience, I guess.
Yes. I'm sorry, we got sidetracked. Your personal.
I mean,
experience.
I was at the time I was pretty anti-Nintendo because I had a Genesis, but my brother had an NES, but I didn't want a Super NES, and so I would celebrate any kind of victory that the Sega had over Nintendo at the time. And I mean, I always remember seeing Final Fight and Streets of Rage side by side in the review crew in the I think the August 1991 issue of Electronic Gaming Monthly. And Final Fight had 8777, and Streets of Rage had 4 9s. And right there, it's like, oh, that's
Genesis does what Nintendo don't.
Exactly. So at the time when this came out, Electronics Boutique, which is like was my favorite video game store at the time, and probably actually of all time, had a very generous return policy where you could buy a game and you had 10 days to return it for any reason. So even if you didn't like it, you just could exchange it for something else. And I remember buying NHL Hockey, the first NHL Hockey, and playing that for like almost 10 days and then bringing it back. And then seeing Streets of Rage there and getting that. And it was amazing. So I played it basically from like the time that it came out, and for a long time I favored it over even the sequels. But I mean, it's I still hold a lot of aspects of it in high regard, but like compared to Final Fight, I wouldn't say that it's better at this point. But I mean, I played it pretty extensively, and it was because they had the 2-player simultaneous. Like that was the reason to play it with your friends.
I feel like that was a real hang up for Nintendo for a while with these beat 'em up games, where like Double Dragon on the NES could not be 2-player, but Double Dragon on the Sega Master System, you could play 2-player. Obviously, they got 2-player in Double Dragon 2 on the NES, but then just to hear that it wasn't 2-player for Final Fight on the Super Nintendo, I'm like, didn't they learn that lesson from Double Dragon? Like, why wouldn't you try? I'm sure there's some bizarre technical limitation, or maybe they just ran out of time. Could have been a number of things.
It's probably a time limit.
I can't imagine the system would have been the limitation.
No. I mean, I have no idea why it took them. Why they weren't able to do that at the time. I guarantee you there's probably a really interesting story behind that.
Probably. I mean, I have no idea here either. I'm just kind of going to, just shoot from the hip, pull out of my ass. But I'm assuming they probably had a limitation, a cap on how big they could make the cartridge. Of course, memory being more expensive back then.
Right.
They didn't have any expansion chips at that time either. So they had to use, all hardware. And also the big deal at that moment was how big can we make our sprites?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
the first thing that comes to mind is like, if you remember the advertisements for the TurboGrafx 16, they're like, look at China Warrior, look how awesome it is. That game is shit, by the way.
It is.
But,
It's not good. But
it's
but
not
that main
good.
character, like those character sprites, are gigantic. They're most of the screen.
Yes. And that was the big push. So I could imagine Capcom was like, we want to make our character models as close to the arcade as possible. And maybe they were like, in order to on us to make this affordable for the consumer, like at $65, $70 and 91, 92 money, they're like, we have to cap it up at like 2 megabits. And because of this, we limit something has to be cut. So we're going to cut one of the players out there. And, who really cares? Because, they don't have friends in couch co-op anyway. So,
Nerds don't have
they don't have
friends.
friends. And I think that's interesting because when we get to the graphics, I have a lot to say about the graphics, but I could see why Sega made the decision that they did, if that's the case when compared to Final Fight, because that would allow Sega to get those two characters in there if they had more graphical limitations,
And a lot more enemies on screen too.
And a lot more enemies on screen. And guess what? Streets of Rage does not look as good as Final Fight.
Yeah, it's not even close. But I mean, I don't know. Like that's a later discussion, I guess.
Of course.
I think then this would be a good time to dive into the game itself. We've kind of gone over our own personal histories with it, done a little bit of diving into the history of the game itself. Some real quick hits of things I want to shout out before we get into the game, though. The game when Noriyoshi Oba first was trying to think of the game or to try to plan the game, he spoke a lot with Yuzo Koshiro, the composer of the game, and they wanted to make a quote unquote street karate game, as they called it. And originally this game was, it's kind of strange. There was a game that Sega made called E-SWAT, or no, sorry, D-SWAT.
E-SWAT. No, it's E-SWAT.
Yeah.
Is it E-SWAT?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So E-SWAT, and that was an arcade game, and they were trying to it was D-SWAT, and then E-SWAT was, I'm so fucking confused now. It was it ended up being, E-SWAT was the arcade game, and then D-SWAT ended up being the working title for Streets of Rage before Streets of Rage became its default thing. Yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting. So, and then they obviously, when they were creating the characters for it, they stuck with, from the research I found, they stuck with the three main characters that we have. You have Axel, Adam, and Blaze, and they did eventually change the name of the game to Bare Knuckle, which is what it was. That's what it is in Japan, correct?
Yes,
that's correct. Yeah.
All right, cool. The original name of Axel before they made him what he is as the final version was God Hand, and he was a white dude from Chicago who looked like Chuck Norris and was a karate expert.
And was just 22 years old.
Yeah, just 20. God Hand, and then
he's been places,
seen so much, done so much.
He's seen some shit.
Killed so many people.
Adam Hunter was originally Blackbird, who was a black dude from London who knows martial arts. They changed his name to Wolf in the beta of the game before he finally was Adam. And the last one for Blaze Fielding, she was originally, this name is even more wild, Pink Typhoon. And she was a character from Hong Kong who knew Kung Fu. And that's about all the descriptors that I was able to find. Actually, shout out to Slopes Game Room, because he has an amazing documentary about the series of Streets of Rage. So I got a lot of the info from him on this. I just find it funny, like God Hand or Axel, he's a karate expert. Okay, that's a very specific brand of martial art. Blaze Fielding, Pink Typhoon, Kung Fu. Okay, that's another brand of martial art. Still a bit vague. There's multiple different types of Kung Fu, but that you can at least attribute to like China.
Yeah.
And then for Adam Hunter or Blackbird, it's just knows martial arts. Just not like mixed martial arts, just martial arts in general.
He's the brawler, really.
Yeah.
That makes a lot more sense then. So I It was designed specifically for home console. It was developed on a heavily modified version of the Golden Axe engine. And that is all I really was able to find for the time being. I little behind the scenes stuff, listeners. I had some stuff going on at home, so I was not able to do as much research on this episode as I would like to, especially for such an iconic series. But now I think is a good time to dive into the game in earnest. And I think we should start off. I want to take a cue from your show, Chris. We're going to start off with the gameplay. Ooh. We're going to break it down. So what are your guys' thoughts? Coury, we'll start with you. What are your thoughts on the gameplay and the mechanics?
I mean, for the time this came out, it had a lot of, because Final Fight introduced the ability to grapple, which is like grab onto your enemies. And then, throw them or you do a suplex or whatever. And this elaborated on that by allowing you to switch sides, like jump over, like grab onto them and jump over behind them and, do a suplex or, it gives you more moves, but also that could be rolled into the 2-player simultaneous allows you to do combo moves with your partner. But I mean, it's a fairly straight brawler where you just, there's no up or down. I mean, like the stages only scroll left to right. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a pretty straightforward brawler with everybody has different moves and different attributes and stuff. But I mean, I feel like they probably made this game very quickly. Because they knew that they had to, go against Final Fight, and I bet you they made it in 6 months, if even that. But
I'd be curious what the development timetable was like for it. Before I go into some of my thoughts, though, Chris, what about you? What do you have to say about it?
To be extremely basic with this, first of all, everything Coury said was absolutely true. But if I could put my own spin on it, it's consoleized Final Fight.
Mm-hmm. That's a good way to put that, because Final Fight it was the arcade experience.
Yes. So the difficulty is better balanced. You could tell that Sega at this point, because this is right around the time Sega had made Sonic the Hedgehog. So they were finally being like, oh, okay, we kind of see what's making Nintendo successful. Maybe not making direct ports of arcade games is wholly the path to success. And you can see that in that design mentality with Sonic the Hedgehog and with Streets of Rage, because the difficulty is far more balanced than what you were getting in Final Fight. And it felt like it was built that way from the ground up. Like all the levels were very organic. You still had like the basic arcade design where you did have a difficulty curve that got harder and harder and harder towards the end. But everything, when it's all said and done, is far more manageable. Even though you have limited continues, and the game knows you have limited continues. So it was kind of built around that concept for beginners as you learn and make your way through it. I also do like what Coury brought up here with how there's different stats. Each of the characters plays markedly different, not as different as they would be in Streets of Rage 2. But I'm going to try and hold off mentioning Streets of Rage 2 as much as possible. It's just hard. But Final Fight also had that. I feel like it's slightly more pronounced in Streets of Rage. Then again, I'm not a big fan of Final Fight, so I might be completely off my rocker. I know Hager plays wildly differently than Cody or Guy does. And you don't see that too much here in Streets of Rage. But like Adam has a different combo that can launch enemies across the screen, whereas Blaze, if you know how to play with her correctly, can do endless combos. Axel sucks. And when it all comes down to it, like, because you have great jumpers with Adam and Blaze, knowing how to use your characters is essential, and knowing how to play them correctly is essential, because they do play differently. So even if you do want to challenge yourself and play as Axel, you can do that, but you really have to work at learning what he's good at and what he's not good at, because the other characters have obviously like different abilities that will make getting through your game a little bit easier if you know what you're doing.
That makes me think of a couple things, actually. That brings up a couple thoughts of mine. So one, I didn't know that Axel was the shitty character.
He's not supposed to be. I just hate him.
Well, so I mentioned before when I was talking a bit about my personal experience that when I was trying to play the game for this episode, I was like, okay, I'm bad at older games, and that's not like a fault of the older games. I'm not even criticizing the design. Older games just had more challenge. They were, it was of the time. I have no issue with that. So I was like, well, let me try to take some of that burden off of this, and I'm going to play a version with save states, so that way I can take my time going through the game. I don't have to play it all in one sitting. I can cut back to a spot to start over right from there, so maybe I don't have to die as often. And while I wouldn't say that I technically beat the game, I can at least say that I experienced it in some way, shape, or form, maybe minus the frustration elements of the difficulty. Well, playing it on a keyboard, first of all, was my first mistake, because I really think I should have found like some type of like controller, USB or Bluetooth or whatever, because it was fucking awful. It was so bad. I could not get the input delay on the emulator. Maybe I was using Kega Fusion, and I deleted the ROMs after 24 hours. I was a good boy. But maybe it was just the emulator I was using or something, but I couldn't.
Or just the fact you're playing it with a keyboard.
Maybe that too. I could not get past the first stage, and I barely got past the first stage, and I was playing as Axel. I do own this game physically, so actually maybe the ROMs wouldn't be illegal because I own the original copy. But and so but my Sega Genesis wasn't hooked up, so I was like, you know what, fuck it, I need to at least play this the way it was intended to, in a fun experience. And I played Blaze as that. I set up my Genesis, which, by the way, I think Genesis is a cooler name than Mega Drive. That's just me personally.
Agree.
But
I don't agree. I love the name Mega Drive.
Really?
Yes.
See, I think Genesis is cooler. Maybe it's my Christian upbringing, and it's Genesis. And
It sounds so much more epic.
It sounds so much more
the
biblical.
Beginning of life. Like life didn't exist before the Genesis.
One little more derail here. It does make for like the JVC XI. It's a better name with the Wonder Mega. The Wonder Mega is a far better name.
Yeah, Wonder Mega is
not
name.
bad. I still think I prefer Genesis, but Wonder Mega is a much better name, 100%. So I did play though on my Genesis, and it was night and day, the difference. Without much challenge, and I mind you, on the emulated version, I switched it down to easy. Which, by the way, difficulty options really cool. You don't see that often in games from this era. As often, obviously, but on the Genesis, I kept it on normal, and I breezed my way through up to about the fourth stage. I think it was the train that I made it to, and so much better, significantly better experience. And what you were saying before, Chris, it's something that I think is like well known in our circles, but I think it's worth mentioning how Sega for the longest time was so focused on arcade ports.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just thinking about this, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but it feels like Streets of Rage was the turning point for them, along with obviously Sonic, for realizing what they needed to do on home consoles. But it's kind of wild to me for Sega, as forward thinking of a company as they were. Obviously, a lot of the way they handled their forward thinking didn't pan out, but they were always trying to push the envelope of console hardware and even arcade hardware. It's odd to me that they were so stuck to an old mentality of the games industry. One of the biggest advertising like boons for companies, like, oh, we have Donkey Kong on our system. We have an arcade perfect, or the closest to the arcade possible of Donkey Kong or Pac-Man or whatever. Arcade ports was like a way to sell a system. And then when the NES came out, it changed all that, and Sega never adapted, and it took them a while to actually make that change. And so I find it kind of interesting that like Streets of Rage and Sonic is kind of the turning point, or the start of the turning point for them, realizing, oh, we have to make games specifically for the home console experience, for the living room experience, not for the arcade experience, and how different that mentality is going into it.
I wonder.
It's amazing to me that they never made an arcade Streets of Rage game.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just thinking about how prolific they were in the arcade, that there just never was one. I never really thought it was weird until like fairly recently, and it's like it seems custom made, especially going against Final Fight. Like on their own. its own turf. It's surprising to me.
Right. And this was right on the time too. They still had the Golden Axe series in the arcades with Golden Axe. Was it Return or Revenge of Death Adder?
Yeah. Revenge.
Yeah. So like that was still an arcade game came out around this time. They could have done it. I mean, they used the Golden Axe engine. So, and you look at a lot of the other games in the series, and was it Streets of Rage 2? We have the bare knuckle arcade machines that are in, I think, like stage 2 or something like that.
Yep.
And Streets of Rage 4, you could take the stun guns, you hit the arcade, and you played an old Streets of Rage level. So I feel like Sega is kind of trying to say they wish they did, but they just didn't. But even more to your point, Keith, it makes me wonder if the realization. Keith. Why did I say Keith? God damn it. Josh, I have too many podcast friends.
Yeah, I was gonna say. I mean, it's got to be tough. It's got to be tough, just remembering, especially, not being able to see anybody. And
I know we're recording without the visual aid this time.
Yeah, but I mean, just in general, so many voices, so many disembodied voices.
Now that I've embarrassed myself, to your point, Josh, about Sega coming to the realization that they need to make console games. I wonder how much that had to do with Yuzo Koshiro coming over, because Revenge of Shinobi came out before this too, and that's a game that was definitely built from the ground up to be a console game.
Yeah, for sure. And I think Noriyoshi Oba was director of that too.
So yeah,
he was the director,
which is one of my favorite Genesis games, by the way.
He was the director of that and Wonder Boy and Monsterland, which I think is the arcade. I think in Slopes Game Room they said it was the arcade version of that, because Wonder Boy has we don't have the time to get into it on this show, but Wonder Boy is one of the most confusing chronologies of like releases ever.
That is absolutely true.
Adventure Island is Wonder Boy, and Adventure Island is also Wonder Boy the Dragon's Trap.
Yeah. I mean, it gets into. I mean, I die every time I hear. It still makes me laugh that Wonder Boy and Monster World on the Genesis. In Japan, it's called Wonder Boy 5 Monster World 3.
Yep.
I actually so Retronauts did an episode on that, and I actually took the time and wrote down branching paths like a tree, just trying to understand what the fuck is this layout, because there's so many different like confusing things. It's exactly what you said, Chris. One of the ports of Wonder Boy or Wonder Boy 3, the Dragons, or whatever the fuck, I don't even remember anymore, but one of those ports was just called Adventure Island, and it has nothing to do with the Adventure Island series that was also spawned off of Wonder Boy. It's one of the
even the game Wampum is like tangentially part of the series.
It is. So there was a port of the second game, and Wampum is technically, so there was a port of the second game where what they did was they changed out the sprites with like different characters. It was like kind of like a port, but also a modification type of thing. Kind of like, doing like taking an anime property and including that in a different game type, or different, and then in a different game format type of thing, or just swapping out Doki Doki Panic and Super Mario Bros. 2. They took Doki Doki Panic and just put Mario in there.
Wait,
that's what
real?
I'm trying to say. What? Sorry,
for real?
What? And so they did a port of that, and that only released in Japan. I think it's like Sayuki World or something like that.
Right, yeah.
And that only released in Japan. And then that did well enough in Japan that they made a sequel to it, Sayuki World 2. And they decided to bring that alone over to the US and to North America and called it Wampum.
This podcast episode is now about Wonder Boy, just so you know.
I do want to do a Wonder Boy episode at some point, but we'll save that for another day. Yeah, it's so wild to me. Sorry, I think did I
Bare knuckling
distract you
Wonder
from
Boy.
your point, Chris, or did I don't know. I don't know where we're at anymore.
Where did we start?
Okay, well, here's what
I think we started with I thought it was Yuzo Koshiro, but you said Obo is also on Revenge of Shinobi.
Yeah.
And,
Well, I
and
mean,
Wonder Boy.
there is a lot of like DNA between Revenge of Shinobi and Streets of Rage for sure.
Oh
yeah, you can just from the graphic style to like the sound effects. He uses the same sound effects.
What I will say, at least to bring it back to Streets of Rage and its gameplay, because that's the section of the episode we're in right now, was one thing I enjoy. One thing I'd like to point out when playing this. So I don't have the nostalgic attachment to this game that both of you do. And what I can say from playing this with no nostalgia tied to it, it is one of the most satisfying feeling games to play. Every every time you hit a button to punch, it feels good. Like it has just this nice clean feeling. The sound effects work really well with it. The animations for the sprites as they are doing the punching animation it works for it. It's fluid. It feels good to play. And even though what I think is brilliant about it is that while the controls themselves are really simple. You only have, at least on the basic Genesis controller, you only have one attack button, one jump button, and one special button. And they are able to use so many different things, depending on the distance you are between your character and the enemy. If you're close enough, you'll grab and be able to throw them, or grab and put them into a headlock and knee them in the face a whole bunch of times, which is also really satisfying. And the fact that a lot of the unique game mechanics come from just spacing, I find really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, there's a lot of different combinations of moves in this game, and I think that's one of the things that really helped sell it at the time. It made it feel, I guess, bigger in a way than Final Fight because of that.
Mm-hmm.
Although, I mean, Final Fight had the super moves, but the super moves in this were screen clearing, like events when they happen.
You were going to say something, Chris?
I think that was one of the advertisements actually about how many moves you could pull off. Unless I'm thinking of Streets of Rage 2, but I think it was Streets of Rage where like Sega
would 40 moves or something like that.
Over 40 moves per character. 3 characters. Like they're just talking about how many different moves you could do with each character individually. And that was a big selling point for that game. To your point about the special moves, by the way, they are cool. The screen clearing special moves.
Mm-hmm.
I hate them because once they're gone, they're gone. And that's like that Shinobi DNA that we were talking about. It's like the magical ninjutsu.
Yeah. Yeah. And it feels very similar when you activate it. It's just like kind of an event where I have like a pre-cinematic type of cinematic, I guess. That's the way to put it.
It almost is able to create an economy with it. It doesn't, because you aren't able to get it back until the next level. But because if it was able to create like an economy with the special moves, where it's like, do you want to risk using it now because you probably won't get it later, or it's really difficult to get another special move. But generally, because you can only get one per level, unless I'm missing something. So if you guys know of another way to get them, I only know that you get one per level, and when you beat it
sometimes
you die
you get like a pickup or something like that, but that's about it.
But
there's only like 2 in the entire game though.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, see that
you can't really count on them at all.
That's frustrating, because otherwise you just end up waiting for the boss. Because why else would you unless you are in dire straits and completely surrounded by enemies? Which if you get good at the game, you won't really like. That didn't happen to me, and I'm bad at beat 'em ups. So like the fact that I'm not great at beat 'em ups, but I was able to manage my way through, admittedly through only the first 4 levels. I know the game does get harder, and I did watch the last level, which just looks insane. It's like this one long hallway.
Mm-hmm.
Did you know the instruction manual calls that guy, the person driving the cop car, calls him the last good guy left on the force? He's the only remaining good character, good person. He's the only like remaining good cop.
It looks like someone's driving though.
Maybe. I don't know.
So
Maybe
his partner's corrupt. He's like, "What are you doing?" "Oh, just shooting bazookas. Don't worry about it." That's what us cops do. Errantly shoot bazookas into the night, or chain guns, what's ever available.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, how does it work out? Does Axel have the this like the rocket launcher or like the single, like the napalm?
I think it depends which character you are. Like if you're player 1, it's the bazooka.
Oh, okay.
And if you're player 2, it's the chain gun thing.
Okay. So is the chain gun is the same thing where it's like the multiple explosions, right?
Right.
Okay. For some reason I thought those were different, but that's not the case.
Actually, and speaking of 2 players, besides obviously the fact that you can play as 2 players with this, I do find something I find super interesting with what this game does with 2 players. It's not like Double Dragon, obviously Double Dragon on the NES you couldn't play 2 players, but you find out in like your brother's your enemy, spoiler alert or whatever, in Double Dragon. In this, it gives both of the players a choice to either join Mr. X. It's Mr. X, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Either join Mr. X or don't join him. And if you both choose the same thing, there's no issue. You either join Mr. X and you're with Mr. X, or you go against him and you both fight him.
Oh no! If you choose to join him, he will like you're standing on a trap door, and he'll send you back 2 levels.
And so you have to either choose to fight him. Or that's interesting.
Well, if you have 2 players, if both characters choose a different option, like one character,
that's what I was getting at.
One player chooses to join, the other one doesn't want to join, then they have to fight each other. Then you get like a secret ending.
Yep. Apparently, that's the quote unquote bad ending. I have a major knack in games recently. This is going to be a little bit of a spoiler conversation for my next episode coming out, which has not been recorded yet, but just thinking of games with like the options of good and bad endings. I've been playing some visual novels recently for the show, and I consistently get the bad endings no matter how, like on my first playthrough every single time. And
I think that they're designed to be that way.
That is so infuriating. I'm not going to go into details as to which ones yet, because one's for a guest spot later on, another one is for... Actually, I guess I could. The one is 9 hours, 9 persons, 9 doors, because that's the Patreon poll topic. That's going to be coming out soon. So that's neither here nor there. But I could totally picture in Streets of Rage, if I was playing 2-player, I know my first playthrough, my friend would be like, well, I'm going to join Mr. X. And I'd be like, well, I don't want to. And then we're going to end up having to fight each other and I'll lose and get the bad ending.
Yeah, but that bad ending is rare. You can only get it if you're playing 2 players.
Oh yeah, no, it's super rare,
which is kind of cool.
But I just love that they included that. Like that's such a unique idea to have something. You're playing with your friend this whole time, and all of a sudden there is this thing that could split you up.
Mm-hmm.
Really cool idea, at least in my opinion.
Yeah.
And before we move on, do you guys have any other comments or thoughts about the gameplay that you want to talk about?
Fuck Mona and Lisa.
Oh, are they the palette swaps of Blaze?
Yeah.
All right. It's been a while. I totally forgot they were even in the game until
there's a formula to them. Like there's a specific, like, of course there is, because that's how these games work. Like one of them, you have to like have your back turned towards her, to her.
Mm-hmm.
And wait until she comes close and do your back attack, which is the C and B button at the same time. And that's how you damage her.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one, you can pretty much freely attack. But if you try to like jump kick the other one, she'll like jump away from you. And if you don't know that tactic, it's something like that. That might not be the exact tactic, but if you don't know the exact tactic to take them down, it's pretty much a war of attrition of you just trying to jump kick them to death and your special moves. Because they are annoying as hell.
I'm trying to think which boss. Actually, this might be a good topic of conversation. Who's your least favorite enemies or bosses, and who's your most? At least for me, my least favorite was the boss I got stuck on, which is why I didn't beat the game. It's the end of level 4. I want to say it's that fire breathing dude who like sprints across the screen. I don't know what it is. I cannot understand his pattern. I've only fought him like once or twice, mind you, but he ruined me.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't remember. I don't know. Like I when I was replaying the game for the first time in a very long time today, I was like, oh, I like this Boomerang guy. He has like such a weird body proportions, like compared to everybody else. Like his it's like he's skipping leg day. He's never had a leg day, I think.
He's all torso and chest, no legs.
Mm-hmm. Can I just give a special, like gameplay wise? Can I just give a special shout out to the like the pepper bomb as being the most like useless fighting or brawler pickup like of all time?
Yes,
there's a reason you never seen it in anything else ever.
I don't even think I found one. I might have. Never mind. I did find them. You're right. They're awful.
It's just like a smoke type thing. It's just like, what even is this?
I also don't like the knives in this because like I like the pipes because you can keep enemies at a distance. It gives you more time to like hit and like swing and hit, so you have a little bit more leeway with that hit window. But yeah, no, I those are the smoke bomb things or whatever they are. I'm not a fan at all.
I will say my least favorite enemy are the budget poisons that you punch and they immediately go down to their knees.
Yes, yeah. Which is, I think that's another thing from Revenge of Shinobi, where there, you can attack certain enemies and they'll just like fall down, and then you can't hurt them, and you walk away, and then they'll turn around and attack you, and you have your back to them.
I have not made it that far in Revenge of Shinobi.
Oh, see,
I've never even played Revenge of Shinobi.
Oh, see, that's top 10 Genesis game for me. I gotta say, Streets of Rage came out. This is my favorite period of time on the Genesis. I like to call it the black grid box era. From the launch until I guess Streets of Rage 2 was one of the first like non-grid boxes, although the cartridge itself does have a black grid, so I'll count that. Before they started doing like complete, before they switched over to doing like the red borders or the red stuff, the red stuff on the side.
The evil Master System period.
Yes, exactly. It's my favorite period of time because I felt like Sega was just firing on all cylinders, and they felt like they were doing their own thing, as well as like not being super reactive, although Streets of Rage is a reaction in a way. I just felt like they were creatively at the top of their game, and it was like an era before game like Genesis game music was made with gems or whatever that when everyone says the Genesis the Genesis music sounds like farts, they're talking about like music using this development kit that they had called gems.
Awful.
It's actually funny. I guessed it on the Main Quest podcast, Keith, as it were. Keith's podcast. But we covered Tasmania on the show, and I'm pretty sure that that soundtrack was used with gems because it is very farty. That soundtrack is so fucking awful. But what I think an interesting point about Streets of Rage is that like you said, Corey, it was kind of reactionary in a sense, but it was a reaction that ended up defining a genre, because there's people like people will compare any beat 'em up to Streets of Rage. Like, yes, Double Dragon is popular and so is obviously Final Fight, but people still look at Streets of Rage as like the standard for home console beat 'em ups, and most beat 'em ups in general. So it's interesting that a reactionary thing, like they saw Final Fight and were like, well, we got to do our own version of that, and they almost ended up surpassing it in every way, other than obviously you mentioned visuals. And which is just you don't normally see that. Normally reactionary stuff doesn't work all that well, and I say that as a I've been doing that James Bond series, and we joke about it. The Bond movies are almost always reactionary to whatever was big the year before. And they almost always do this half-baked idea version of whatever they are basing it off of. Like, if to go with a more recent example of it, if you've seen the movie Spectre, it's basically Captain America Winter Soldier, but with James Bond. Obviously, if you get into the older James Bonds, like Moonraker was a reaction to Star Wars. The Man with the Golden Gun was a reaction to Enter the Dragon. Live and Let Die was a reaction to all the blaxploitation films of the 60s and 70s and shit like that. Like, usually the reactionary stuff is never as good as what it's reacting to, and Streets of Rage kind of defied that trend and ended up being the standard that everyone was reacting to. So it's kind of an impressive thing that Sega pulled off to do that. And one of the ways they did that, obviously, besides the gameplay just being solid and fun, I was debating if we should talk about visuals or music next. I kind of want to go into music because I feel like that's the bigger standout, but I also wonder, do you think we should end with music? What do you guys think?
Oh, I mean, if you want to make the sandwich, I want to end with music.
Well, all right, then we'll go with visuals next. Visuals, because I think, Corey, you mentioned you wanted to talk about sound effects and music. Didn't you also mention you wanted to talk about some of the sprite work and stuff like that? Or am I completely misremembering and putting words in your mouth?
I mean, the sprites in this game, they're pretty good. I mean, obviously, they're much smaller than what we saw in Final Fight.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's too bad because I think that, whatever sprite work there was in this, like, had its thunder completely so thoroughly stolen by the second game that this just looks kind of, in retrospect, it just like does not look that great. But I mean, I don't know. I think that at the time, like, everything's smaller than Final Fight, but I don't know. See, you could have 12 characters on screen at one time, 12 enemies.
I personally, I actually don't have Streets of Rage 2 to compare it to, because I literally didn't even look up visuals of it to remind myself what Streets of Rage 2 looked like. I've played it like once before, so oh
my gosh, you got to play that.
I own
like
it.
Tomorrow.
You have to. I do own it. That is, I do own Streets of Rage 2, so I could.
And, like, I think that like in a way that kind of hurts Streets of Rage 1, because I mean, in many ways, Streets of Rage 2 is the best brawler of all time.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
And I think that, it's nice. You see where like those roots kind of started with this first one. But I mean, at this point in time, you can't have a conversation about Streets of Rage 1 without talking about Streets of Rage 2. So I think it's okay if we just like talk about Streets of Rage 2 also, just like, because it's just impossible. Because
I think as long as we don't go too far into it, because I will do an episode on Streets of Rage 2 at some point, and I don't want to ruin the conversation on that type of thing. But
it's just we can't talk about Streets of Rage 1 without like and pretend that Streets of Rage 2, isn't one of the best games of all time. I guess.
Absolutely. Like, you have to acknowledge Streets of Rage 2 in many of these conversations just because of how much of a leap there was.
Yes. And it's just, it's that good of a game.
I
think that a lot of people probably don't think about Streets of Rage 1 nearly as much because of how good 2 is.
Well, I guess it's kind of like, part of the point of me covering games like this is like, it's something for me to experience that I have not been able to experience yet, or like seriously sit down and analyze and talk about. But also B, it's one of those ones where I actually talked about this on an episode on my Dark Age of Camelot episode with Matt Smith, where too often people focus on the origins and the end point and don't look enough at the stepping stones. And while Streets of Rage technically is the origin point for Streets of Rage, it's not the origin point of like the best, like if Streets of Rage 2 is the pinnacle of side-scrolling beat-em-ups, the beginning wouldn't be Streets of Rage 1. It would be, I guess technically Karate Champ or whatever it is on the NES, or what?
Wonder Boy Monsterland.
Or Wonder Boy Monsterland.
Renegade, I think, is like one of the
Renegade, yeah.
So like you look at that and you don't pay attention to the stepping stones, and that's why I kind of like to do stuff like this where it still acknowledge, obviously, Streets of Rage 2, like you said, you can't not, because at the very least, you can look at this and be like, well, this is where they got this from Streets of Rage 2, and this is where they ended up enhancing it. And obviously, we'll discuss that in more depth for the inevitable Streets of Rage 2 episode.
Yeah.
And when I look at the visuals here for Streets of Rage, when I want to more go back to, and I'm sorry, Corey, I had to look up some information here. Shout out to Here's My Question for You.
No, that's fine.
But Streets of Rage was a 4 megabit cart.
Okay.
And Final Fight was 8 megabits.
What?
So
right. Yeah.
I don't know how they weren't able to get 2-player on that, but I'm not a programmer. I'm not even going to try and guess. But
probably it's got to be sprite size.
Has to be.
But I mean, they wouldn't, like, even the arcade version of Final Fight, like, you probably didn't have more than like 6 enemies on screen at once. I mean, there might be maybe it's hard to say because it gets pretty rowdy at times.
I mean, the Sega CD version has everything you want if you really want to go for Final Fight.
Yeah,
everything's there.
It's I think it's the best version of that of Final Fight.
Oh, absolutely. But more to Streets of Rage 1 on the Genesis. I've said this before in the past, and I don't mean it to sound too detrimental because I still think it looks good. But Streets of Rage doesn't look too far removed from a Master System game. It looks better than Golden Axe, but I would say the same thing about Golden Axe.
Yeah.
It has a look to it that's really similar to another early Genesis game that Sega developed in Jewel Master.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very similar. It's just kind of this pre-Sonic console design philosophy I think Sega just kind of had. Does it look bad? No, it's completely serviceable. But then you go to Streets of Rage 2, which is 16 megabit, 4 times the size. That's a lot more memory they could have done for the sprites, for animations, for moves. So again, as Corey was saying, playing Streets of Rage 2 and going back to Streets of Rage 1 kind of does it a disservice because of how much that leap was, especially if I'm coming into it, never, playing Streets of Rage 2 first. I kind of already assume Streets of Rage 1 is the lesser, and it is in almost every way. But like for someone like me or a lot of other people who have played Streets of Rage 2 first, easing into it because of those visuals that are just like baseline 16-bit, a game that probably could have been done on the TurboGrafx 16, not taking a knock at that. Great system, more colors, everything like that. But in terms of sprite and memory, couldn't do as much as the Genesis. That's kind of where Streets of Rage is for me. And I think it's really impressive that it stood the test of time more than the SNES port of Final Fight. Because, again, as we mentioned, graphics were the selling point of systems.
Yes.
So for the gameplay to stick to shine through those graphics, because it does not look anywhere near as good as Final Fight, in my opinion, with the exception of environmental effects, because you have the rain on the beach and like the animations in the background and stuff. Yeah,
and I mean, in a lot of ways, Streets of Rage, the environmental graphics peak in the first level. With the neon signs, the pine pot signs.
I think that's why when you talk about it, I was so surprised. Just neither of you are really shitting on the visuals, but just by comparison, obviously to Streets of Rage 2, they're not as nearly as good. But I really enjoyed the visuals of the game. So when you were talking about them, like I don't think it looks like a Master System game in the size. I think what you said though, Chris, how it's more of kind of like a what did you say, TurboGrafx 16, right?
Yeah.
I mean, early Genesis.
You should see the Master System.
Yeah, I could definitely see that more because that's
I mean, the Master System version is like, oof.
And then there's the Game Gear port as well.
But compared to like back to Wonder Boy and the Dragon's Trap,
right?
It doesn't feel like it's like, yes, it's a superior graphic presentation, visual presentation. Not arguing that. It just doesn't look as far removed from the Master System as Streets of Rage 2 does. Streets of Rage 2 looks like it's competing with the Super Nintendo. Streets of Rage does not, if you know what I mean.
I don't know. I still think it. I mean, maybe I just have a bad perception of like what graphics were, because like I look at Streets of Rage 1 and it looks so much better than any 8-bit system. Like, I don't know. I don't see that necessarily, but I'm not trying to argue that it's like obviously that it's better than Streets of Rage 2. I'm not that in the slightest. I don't see that it's. I mean, I guess by definition, because it's an earlier like entry in the console, it's one of the earlier releases, excuse me, for the Genesis. Well, of course, it's going to look closer to like a Master System, but to me, like the gap between Streets of Rage 1 and 2 is smaller than the gap between Streets of Rage 1 and stuff on the Master System, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I wouldn't
Makes
say
sense.
that it looks like a Master System game, but I would say that for the time period, it was perhaps less impressive looking than even something like Golden Axe, which had much bigger characters, like with the giants and everything, and different like mounts you could ride in. I just didn't feel like everything about Streets of Rage points to it like having been developed in a very short amount of time. The game even runs at 30 frames per second, which is surprising. It kind of surprised me because I had totally forgotten about that. And I didn't even notice it until I watched the opening story scroll, and you can see the city kind of moves a little choppy in the background.
Yeah.
And I had even, I guess when you're in the heat of the moment, though, you don't really notice that. But
yeah, I also don't notice frame rates. I'm like the worst person to ask when it comes to stuff like that. Like like I can see that. Like if you ask me to if you tell me which one is 60 and which one is 30, I can tell the difference. And I can, if it's something like really noticeably better, then I can tell. But generally, I don't know. Like if I'm not like specifically looking for it, I'm like, oh, that's 30 frames per second, or oh, that's 60. But I never noticed it. But I'm assuming then Streets of Rage 2 is 60 frames per second.
yes, yeah.
All right. I don't know. Is there anything else you guys want to talk about with the visuals then? Because I think we've hashed it out enough. It like you said, it laid the groundwork for the series, but obviously they perfected it with Streets of Rage 2, which now I really need to fucking play.
You're in for a treat. You're gonna, I can't properly convey just how big of a jump that is. I mean, it looks like completely different hardware.
I'm excited. I've looking up screenshots of it, but I don't think it's really doing it justice at all. So like I said, I own a copy. I'm gonna have to do that. Any final thoughts on visuals before I'm gonna throw it over to you, Chris, after the visuals, because you wanted to talk about the music, and I wanna hear you gush about it.
Well, I mean, the music is
Yuzo
the enduring aspect, I think, of
it's
Yuzo. Fuck it. Who cares about the visuals now? Let's just talk about the music.
The debate I typically have when it comes to Streets of Rage's music is what is possibly the greatest video game soundtrack of all time, Streets of Rage or Streets of Rage 2. It's so good. It's so varied. I think Streets of Rage 2 is a little bit more varied, but like the top quality of the songs in Streets of Rage 1 probably beat out the top quality of the songs in Streets of Rage 2.
Yes, I would completely agree with you on that. I think that the music in the first one is better. In many ways, the best tracks in the second one are remixes of tracks from the first game.
Or homages, very similar. Like Fighting in the Street and Go Straight are very similar tracks. Fighting in the Street's better. Yeah. I think, they both have incredible range. Violent, like I can think of like Violent Breathing. The elevator stage is fantastic. Of course, you have the Mr. X theme that's in both games. That's both very good. Is it Walking on the Beach or Moon Beach? I don't know which one, but that song,
I think Moon Beach is in the first one.
That is a fantastic track. Yeah. The high highs are definitely higher in Streets of Rage 1. I think the overall soundtrack is better in 2. But like I hear Fighting in the Street, and that is a jam that I think you can put in any club in the mid 90s and not tell them it's a video game soundtrack, and you'll have people just like drop an E to it like left and right. They would be having a great time. I just somewhat, but like that's where Yuzo Koshiro, I believe, got a lot of the inspiration for the Streets of Rage soundtrack was club music.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I went to MagFest years ago, and he had a DJ set there. And,
wow.
And played music from the game there.
So you're telling me I could have gone to MagFest, dropped E, and watched Yuzo Koshiro perform a DJ set?
Yes.
You didn't have to drop E, but I mean,
yeah, I didn't have to drop E, but you could, I got him to sign my E's 1 and 2.
Wow, that's awesome.
At the time, it's like before I kind of got back in the games, and I was like, found myself like not having anything else to really take him.
That's
silly to me.
That's so cool that he performed there. That's amazing, because it's like you don't see too many Japanese game devs over on this side of the pond, you know?
Yeah, well, it was a big deal for him to go to that, for sure.
That's so fucking cool. I mean, yeah,
he seems like a really, really, just like a really nice guy. Have you ever like seen his stuff on Twitter and stuff? Like his English, he like just sounds like a native English speaker.
Oh,
It's
really?
insane.
Okay.
Well, he's a vampire.
His English is so good. Yeah, really. He's like is ageless, really.
Very handsome man. Just saying.
But for me, like in terms of the music in this, I would say that the level 5 music, the one on the boat, is probably my favorite track in the entire game. And it feels very much like a callback to like some of the music tracks in Revenge of Shinobi, which Revenge of Shinobi's soundtrack is very much, him learning the tools to make Streets of Rage. And it feels very similar in a lot of ways.
He still likes to. So a lot of his music for this game, I believe, was composed using FM synthesis.
He's the master of FM synth.
He still likes to compose with that. Like he still uses that. Like, you know how some composers will use like MIDI to start off, so that way they don't have to do any like fancy recording stuff just to get an idea, and then they record the nice versions. He just does everything with FM synth, and it's beautiful.
Which is really cool. I think that he still celebrates that. I think that he enjoys making things as difficult for himself as possible.
Well, what is it? Like limitations are the fuel for creativity, right?
Yep,
limitations breed creativity. Yep.
And that's the thing. I mean, you mentioned it earlier as well, Coury, speaking about gems and how many games on the Genesis sound like farts, and or they just sound like there's even times
that's absolutely the case.
Sometimes they don't use gems, and it sounds like they're not using FM synth properly, because as a FM synth, I feel, is one of those tools that musicians can use on these systems when they don't have what they had over on the Super Nintendo with the Sony chip and sampling and everything like that. That when you get it wrong, you get it wrong. It doesn't sound good. It sounds a generation behind. But here's Yuzo Koshiro using the system's hardware, and it sounds better than, I think, almost anything on the Super Nintendo in terms of sound quality, the majority of which.
Yeah.
And he's just using FM synth. He's not using sampling or anything. So his ability to compose music and get the sound he does out of that just goes to show the mastery that he has over the Sega Genesis's hardware and how he can deliver, because there's no denying anyone. Just go listen to the soundtrack. If you haven't listened to it, just play it and just sit back in a chair and relax. Or turn off the lights and throw in a disco ball. Whatever your preference, you're gonna have a good time.
It's one of those the type of music where, like, if it wasn't like written in FM synthesis, it would still be good, of course, but like you wouldn't know it's from, how like sometimes you can listen to a song and be like, oh, that sounds very game like. It sounds like it's something straight out of a video game. Usually anything that has like, kind of like that Mega Man style or like Mario style has like a very, strong melody with a little bit backing, with a little backing behind it. This music is very, like, it's like you said, it's so varied. It goes through so many different genres. It's just extremely well written, of course, too. It's catchy. And the funny thing is I remember, it's easy for stuff to get overhyped. Like you'll go into a game and you hear all of this praise and hype about it, and then you play it and you're like, that's not as fucking good as everyone said it was. It happens to me all the time. Hollow Knight is an example of that for me. Everyone was praising it, gave it a shot, couldn't get into it. This music, however, was not that for me. I've heard, I mean, I'm part of this space. I've heard the praises of Yuzo Koshiro sung to the high heavens. I've heard it all over the place. It's fantastic. It really is. It's a really good soundtrack, and even if you begrudgingly are trying to be like, oh, it's not fucking that good, you can't. It's still good. it's still good.
Oh,
Even if it's not your style of music or something, which I do enjoy this style of music, but if this genre that he writes in for this game is not your cup of tea, it still is. Like you'll still listen to it and be like, wow, that's really well done. It'd be like, I'm not into opera, but if you hear an opera, you'll be like, wow, that was, they did a whole bunch of interesting shit with that. Maybe opera's not the best example, but you get the idea.
You like opera, but I don't like opera, but I like the opera scene in Final Fantasy 3.
Yeah.
It's just I was gonna say, as somebody who like doesn't listen to this kind of music that much, I still think that the music is like the defining aspect of this and enjoy it a lot. But I wouldn't just like listen to this style of music like outside of the game, I guess. So that crossover does like you're absolutely right what we were saying. Like that crossover is absolutely true.
I do think what Yuzo Koshiro illustrates is that it depends on who is it's the artist, not the tools necessarily, because as we've said with the I mentioned with Tasmania, it's one of the worst soundtracks I've ever heard.
If you want to call it that.
If for those who have not listened to my episode with Keith on the main quest, I described it as a Foley artist having a panic attack. It's just what it's all over the place. And supposedly the people who developed that game are the people who help teach other game developers how to write music for the Sega Genesis.
Oh, it shows.
Yeah.
Oh, it hurts. And so, but then you look at stuff like this and you look at what he was able to do. And even like, I know he didn't write the Sonic music, but you look at stuff like Sonic, you see what competent composers could do once they understood the limitations of the hardware they were working with. And it's fantastic. The results speak for themselves. It's a really great soundtrack.
Yeah. And just talking about like Oshiro's range, like his game right before Streets of Rage was ActRaiser, which is, completely different.
Yeah.
Pretty amazing.
And he's composing Etrian Odyssey now. And even before that, you have your copy of East 1 and 2 signed by him because he wrote the music for that, which is completely different style than Streets of Rage, completely different style than Revenge of Shinobi.
He also very recently he wrote 2 tracks. Just in speaking of his range that we're all talking about, he wrote 2 tracks for Mina the Hollower from Yacht Club Games.
Oh, really? That's cool.
I haven't listened to it. I haven't played Mina. Is it even out? Is Mina the Hollower out yet?
No.
I didn't think so. I know
Not
it's
yet.
like there's like betas going around and stuff like that, but yeah, guy's incredible. Like just absolutely incredible. Coury, you mentioned off mic about sound effects as well. Was there anything? Is that still? Did we touch on that already, or did I?
Well,
miss?
I mean, the sound effects are a lot of them were carryovers from Revenge of Shinobi, but I would say that the consuming food sound effect in Streets of Rage might be like a top 5 video game sound effect of all time, maybe top 3 video game sound effect. It's like it's so good, and you can put that it can be the sound effect for anything, and it works.
Also, I love the fact that if you are playing it on the Sega CD as part of one of those compilation discs that came with the system, the voices are improved.
Oh yeah, the one that came with the Sega Classics or collection or whatever it is. But the voices are improved, but I feel like they got rid of like different kinds of screams, or maybe I'm thinking the Golden Axe version.
Maybe
they made it so all the voices are just like ooh instead of like actually screaming a little bit.
No, I think you're right. They are all the same. I think they're a little bit different for like the main characters, but for all the characters that die, they all sound the same. I need to go back and play it though.
Yeah, because I remember on that disc, all these games like had certain improvements, but there was always I think that the version of Streets of Rage 2 on that Sega Classics collection is only single player.
No.
Then it's Golden Axe is only single player. One of them like removes the second player.
Huh.
Like they all like have certain improvements, but they all have like aspects that are actually worse. I'll revisit it because I feel like either Golden Axe or Streets of Rage removed the 2-player
On iOS, it removed the 2-player for Streets of Rage.
Really?
Well, why would it do that?
Yeah. That's like half the reason to play, honestly.
I mean, it's iOS though. Like, did they? It came out in 2009. I mean, I guess you could do. Did it have the infrastructure for internet play? You know.
I would hope so.
Oh,
At least
also
local.
on the port of it on the Master System was 1-player only.
Yes.
I'd have to look it up. I tried to quickly do it.
And in the Game Gear version, Adam is omitted.
Oh, yeah, from the Game Gear. Okay, so it says here, Streets of Rage is generally the same as the Genesis version, aside from the voices, which are CD quality enhanced. Well, I feel like I got to revisit that. It's been a long time since playing that version.
It's been a while. Do you guys have any other? Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
I just think that's wild about the iOS, because at least you could have done local play. The DS was out doing local play.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
like if you both had a copy, it could have definitely supported it. You know what? They didn't put enough mega power into the download.
But if it's too late now, unless you've like hacked your system. But the Sega 3D version of this on the 3DS is excellent. The way that the 3D is handled, like going in and out of the background.
Ooh,
I highly recommend it if you've hacked your system, because you can't get it any other way now. So
right, which is extraordinarily easy to hack.
Yes,
should be said.
Real quick, sorry, just a quick question: is the Megatech system? This is kind of random. I'm sorry. The Megatech system, the one that was kind of like the Play Choice 10, where it just had Sega Genesis games on there.
I have not heard of the Megatech.
Yeah, it doesn't sound familiar.
The reason I asked that is because on Wikipedia, we mentioned at the very beginning there was no arcade port of Streets of Rage. It says on Wikipedia there was.
Well, is the Megatech, was that made by Tectoy?
That's what I'm wondering.
It could have been in Brazil.
Megatech arcade. I don't know. Well, I can look into it. But it says it released in 91, and the Megatech system. Hold on, this is from SegaRetro.org. The Megatech system is an arcade cabinet released by Sega in 1989, and Western counterpart to the Mega 6. It was
okay. So
sorry, go ahead.
Is it pretty much like a Play Choice type thing?
Yep, similarly to Nintendo's Play Choice 10. So, yes, there is technically never like an arcade, like designated arcade cabinet for Streets of Rage, but you could technically play it in the arcade. It was just in kind of one of those Play Choice 10 style things of it was just a bunch of Genesis games there.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I do want to say something about the sound. I know I'm kind of doubling back here, and
no, it's fine. I'm the one that got us sidetracked on that when I was trying to look up some of the stuff.
But one thing that makes a beat 'em up great, that separates beat 'em ups apart from each other, is that when you make your punches and attacks, that you feel like you're making contact.
Yes.
And one of the best ways to do that is with effective sound.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what Streets of Rage, like even 3, which I don't like to talk about, does it very well. Is when you punch an enemy, it sounds crisp. It sounds like you're making contact, and it almost sounds like it's like you can't feel a sound. You can feel that sound. It adds and enhances the gameplay, which is something, like I said, most beat 'em ups get wrong. Like massively wrong, and Streets of Rage just nails it.
Yeah. Back when Streets of Rage 4 came out, John Linneman did a video on Streets of Rage 4, and he talks about the John Linneman at Digital Foundry did a video on Streets of Rage 4, and he talks about like the different pillars of fighting games and where Streets of Rage really excels, and that sense of contact and like the sound of like the hits is like one of the main aspects, because there's like a kind of a visceral feeling to it, like the impact and the way that they like the enemies react to it, for sure.
That's perfect.
All right, I don't really have much else to add to this to the game. I think. Do you guys have any things you want to add? Not just to the music or anything, but is there anything you want to add to this to talk about the game that we have not discussed yet? Any points that we have not brought up yet that you want to dive into?
Not really, but you should play this game with an arcade stick with turbo functions.
Yeah. Using an arcade stick is key, I think. It just has a very solid feel. Like the old Genesis 3-button arcade stick. I can't remember what it's called. I had the option to buy a game or buy that arcade stick, and I bought the arcade stick, and I was like, why did I do this? But I still have it now. It's really, really solidly built and is good for playing games like this. Yeah, I mean, I feel as though maybe like I've been hard on this game, I guess, during, talking about it, but like, I don't want to take away from the fact that, everything that it set up, was super important. And at the time, this game wouldn't have existed if not for Final Fight. And I think that for it to, come out basically at the same time and do, everything that the home version of Final Fight did and more, I think that's like just really a testament to, that's Sega like under pressure, but also just very confident. This is a good, this is like a sign of like of a confident Sega, I guess.
Yeah, I would also echo what Coury is saying here, is that this is showing Sega maturing, not just like bringing in more mature content, but just bringing in content that was aimed towards an audience that had been playing games since 85, 83, 77 with the Atari. They found this is a game that kind of targeted that audience and really started to mature beyond it with its follow-on installments, and does still deliver an experience that felt like you were playing the arcade at home without the just outright brutal and cheap difficulty. So even, yes, it gets eclipsed rather quickly by its predecessor, but without this game, and
I mean, its successor.
Yes, it gets eclipsed rather quickly by its successor, with Streets of Rage 2. But like, this does establish a lot, and Coury's absolutely right that this wouldn't existed without Final Fight. A lot of the enemies, like I guess the signals, the Y signals, and they're ripped right out of Final Fight. It's copyright infringing, but it still manages to cut out its own identity and be its own thing, in making it really, even though it does fall well short of Streets of Rage 2, it's still easily one in the upper echelons of the genre.
I think a point I want to make about this game to wrap up is kind of tying in a couple things that stuff that each of you said. Like Coury, you mentioned about how it was kind of like a little bit of that turning point of them kind of realizing what made a console game. And then Chris, you were saying you mentioned like a more mature audience, and that was intentional. Streets of Rage 1, from what I looked up, did not do all that well in Japan, but it did very well here over in North America. And so it was they really pushed to bring Streets of Rage 2 over because it was part of that marketing push that Sega kind of coming of age, as you described it. I think you said that, Coury.
It was for older audiences.
Yes,
for sure.
It was them being like, we're going to appeal to an older audience. The whole Genesis does what Nintendo don't, and then obviously later on with Mortal Kombat, the blood in that versus the Super Nintendo version and all that other good stuff. But like, it was them finally, it was the start of them realizing what needed to happen for them to compete in the console space. And as we saw with the console war back then, they owned it for quite some time until Nintendo, towards the little after the midway point of the generation, started switching the tide. But that should never diminish what Sega did with the Master System and Sega Genesis, just because the end result ended up, I believe the Super Nintendo eventually outsold it, but Nintendo went from a huge market share in the NES era in North America to, what was it, like 50% or something like that? They were like at 80% or some shit like that, like crazy high in North America back in the 80s. And then the Genesis comes out and almost single-handedly diversifies the entire game market in the US. And to tie that back to Streets of Rage. Streets of Rage was part of that turning point for them.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's at a time, that this is a time where, Sega knew what they wanted to do, I think, and they had a pretty good game plan before, they just got split into different directions. I mean, they were, I don't know, like, I want to say they were firing on all cylinders, but I think that they probably were at this time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, creatively, for sure.
I mean, hell, even with the flops of the 32X and the Saturn, I still say they were firing on all cylinders. They just spread themselves too thin. That's a topic for another day. Of where did Sega go wrong? But I mean, that's going to be discussed in gaming circles for years to come. But
10-part series.
Yeah, it'd be so much. I would love to talk about it. I love this era of Sega. I think Sega will always have like some level of mystique to me, just because of the end of the Genesis, the Saturn, and into the Dreamcast era. Just this crazy amount of like interesting and bizarre ideas that not all of them pan out, and some of them do, but more in like retrospect, they don't pan out for them in the market, but then you'll go back and play a game like, holy shit, this was inventive, that kind of thing. So Sega will always have that kind of mystique to me for this era. And I think it's why, I don't know, I've always kind of gravitated towards Sega. And the only reason I don't do as many episodes on it is because I don't have enough experience with it. And unfortunately, as we were discussing a little bit off mic, a lot of content creation is Nintendo centric, so it's not always easy to find guests to dive into Sega stuff, which, Corey, I'm going to have you back on for more Sega stuff. Let's wrap up this episode of the podcast, though. I want to thank you both for joining me for this episode. This was a great discussion about a great game. And I want to throw it over to you guys for some shout outs and things you want to promote and plug. Corey, I want to start with you. What would you like to promote, and where can the good people find you online?
Well, since this is a podcast, I can properly promote the podcast that I do with Chris from Classic Gaming Quarterly, where it's just not about anything. The podcast is called Here's My Question for You. And I mean, we talk about, breakfast cereal. We talk about music. We talk about like whatever, just like we talk about Target. Talk about like a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't even matter. It's just, you can view it as, just like hanging out with some people who know each other, but don't know know everything about each other. And we just like, a couple of mid 40 somethings just BSing for an hour and a half every week about whatever is stuck in their craw.
And of course, obviously, the My Life in Gaming YouTube channel.
Yep, of course. Yeah.
Oh, always got to shout that out as well. And Chris, what would you like to promote? Where can the good people find you online?
Well, I am part of the Retro Hangover podcast. Me and Shane Koski host that show. And we talk about retro video games that are older than 10 years old, or we cover a topic or showcase a person or a piece of hardware. And you can find both Corey and Josh on a couple of our episodes over there. If you want to check those out, they're high quality, I promise you. And if you want to find that and know where you can find that at, just go to Linktree/Retro Hangover. That's linktr. Sorry, that's linktr.ee/Retro Hangover. And yeah, you can find all of our stuff there. And we hope to see you. And we would love to hear what you think of our stuff. And we do appreciate it. Thank you and once again, thanks for having me, Josh. Really do appreciate it.
Dude, thank you.
It's been so fun.
Guys, thank you so much for seriously. Thank you both for coming on for this. And it was funny when I was talking to Corey. I'm like, I got to get you on the show, and we were going back and forth trying to come up with ideas of like a topic. And then when we settled on Streets of Rage, I'm like, I gotta get Chris on this too. Like, he would kill me if I didn't get him on the show to talk about his favorite series. Arguably, what did you consider Streets of Rage your favorite series?
Final Fantasy, but I mean, Streets of Rage 2 is my favorite game, so I have to talk about Streets of Rage, right? Like they go hand in hand.
Yeah.
All right. Well, as for me, as usual, you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at StillLoadingPod on all of them. If you want to email me, you can email me stillloadingcontact@gmail.com. If you want to support the show, you can do so in a number of ways. Give it a 5-star rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whichever podcasting app you use, because it makes me feel warm and fuzzy, and I like feeling warm and fuzzy. But you can also support the show monetarily if you throw in a couple bucks. If you throw a couple bucks my way for $1 a month, you get all the episodes a few days earlier at a better audio quality, a better bit rate, as well as patron voting rights. I do quarterly patron polls to help decide future episode topics of the show. So if you want to help guide the conversation of the show, you can do that for as little as $1 a month. But if you want to get more for $4 a month, you get everything at the $1 level plus access to two mini bonus episodes, every month. That involves me doing a series over there where I torture myself through the 220-in-1 handheld games type of thing, where they're fantastic knockoffs. I don't know if you want to play. If you've ever died to learn about Curly Monkey and its sequel, Curly Monkey 2. That's the series for you. And finally, the $5 level, you can get everything I mentioned the previous 2 tiers, plus access to Still Bonding, which is a James Bond podcast for me and some friends, bond over 007. And in fact, in speaking of My Life in Gaming, Try from My Life in Gaming was on an episode with me for that. We talked about, oh my gosh, which one did he do? He did Live and Let Die with me. So yeah, if that interests you, patreon.com/stillloadingpod. And the final shout out, of course, is the Bit by Bit Foundation. The Bit by Bit Foundation is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to put video games and video game consoles in the hands of kids receiving inpatient care at hospitals. So if you want to support them, go to bitbybitfoundation.org and consider donating. And that is all the time I have for you on this episode of the podcast. Corey, Chris, thank you once again for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Josh.
And with all that said, we had a rager in the sheets, and we will see you all next time.